verses 1 to 3. Let me, something is a little loud, maybe in monitors. Yeah. Let me really extend my appreciation to Brother Henry. You see, this was done last week and up this week, and it was quite a task to get it up. We had to have the computers checked. That was done, I think, on Thursday. And then we had to go check out what we needed. Actually, we had to redo the system, change from S-Video, for those of you who know what I'm talking about, to HDMI. And we had a function all day yesterday. So, I may drop this a little bit. I'm not sure that might be creating a problem. We had a function all day yesterday that ended at 3. I happened to be around here, and in fact it ended about 4, and after that Henry was running all the cables and so on to get this up for us this morning. And then we discovered we have an issue with this television. When we put it on, it's shorting everything else out. So we had to leave this one off, but hopefully by next week we'll have this one, this monitor up for you as well. But I really wanted to express my appreciation to Brother Henry Boyce for making sure this was taken care of. Amen. Exodus chapter 20, verse 1. And God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. And of course, verses 1 and 2 are the introduction, and the commandment is actually in verse 3. Just give me one moment to make an adjustment here. The commandment is actually in verse 3, and we'll come around to that commandment. But as we come back to this, I want to give some principles of interpretation when you look at the commandments, and you will see me doing this as we go through them. Right? Each commandment is based on a specific characteristic of the nature of God. So underlying each commandment is a broad principle, and you will see this more clearly when we look at some of the commandments. So each commandment, because it underlines a broad principle, each commandment is a specific case of a general rule. So it's a specific case of a general rule. And some people suggest it's normally the worst breach that you can have. So each forbids sins of a similar nature. So thou shalt not kill, for example, forbids cruelty and injury to life, even though it is not murder. So we have two, thou shalt not kill, and then another, right? And the other thing is that when you see a prohibition, it also presupposes the opposite positive command. So if there's something you are not to do, then it presupposes that there is something you will be doing instead, right? So for example, take this one, honor your father and mother. Then it means that you will not dishonor your father and mother. So the other side of it is also important. I'll say one more introductory thing as I continue to study this. The commandments can be described as a bill of rights, because it's another way of looking at them. We talked about them as having to do with love, but they also have to do with rights. And I'll just quickly run through this without saying more. So the first one that we'll talk about in a minute some more is God's right to exclusive allegiance. The second one is God's right to self-definition that says that you should, and these two are connected, but we'll show you how. The second one talks about worship. The first one says you shall have no other God, and the second one talks about worship, but they both talk about worship. Right? Then the third, God's right and proper representation by his people. You shouldn't take his name in vain. Then God's right to people's time, a household's right to humane treatment by the head of the house. And I'm not sure which one that is. My wife had to help me. Number 5, my parents' right to respect, as honor your father and mother. My neighbor's right to life, do not kill. My neighbor's right to secure marriage, you are not to commit adultery. My neighbor's right to personal property, I think you shall not covet. And then my neighbor's right to an honest hearing in court, which is you shall not bear false witness. And my neighbor's right to secure existence in the community. So it's another way of looking at them. They really talk about rights and respecting the rights of others. The first 4 have to do with the rights, God's rights, and the second protects the rights of the community. So that's just to give you, again, some framework. And then let's come now and let's focus on this first commandment. Next week we will not be giving you much framework, but focusing on the commandment. So note, if you take in from verse 1, the introduction, that the commandments begin with God. It says God spoke, and then God says some things about himself. And this is very important because it underlies where life begins and ends. Life begins and ends with God, whether we recognize it or not. God himself lies at the heart of the commandments. These are God's commandments, and his name and character are stamped on them. So they tell us something about who God himself is. They tell us something about who God himself is. And also, as we think about this, it is only possible to obey the commandments when we are in proper relationship to God. Now, notice I said it's only possible because I posit to you, some people may say this is not so that the commandments can be obeyed. They can be kept. But it is only possible to keep them when we are in proper relationship with the God who gave them. And we'll come back to that notion of relationship closer to the end. The commandments begin with a declaration about who God is. I am the Lord your God. And then he says some things about himself. And this command, this first one, really underpins all the others. Because if we do not recognize God as God, then we will not be inclined to obey or to observe anything that he says. So Dr. Ravi Zacharias, he says some people point to the evil in the world. And they say because of the evil in the world, there cannot be a God. And he says, there's a slight problem with this. Because there can only be evil if there is some moral law that makes something good and makes something evil. And he goes on in his logical argument to say that there cannot be a moral law without a moral law giver. It has to come from somewhere. And cannot come from an immoral person or an immoral lawgiver. So it has to come from a moral lawgiver. Right? And of course, he points that this moral lawgiver is God. If you get rid of God, then who decides? And we'll see an attempt to do this later on. Then who decides? Right? Then who decides? And he observes this as well. He said, now we say there is no law, we don't need any God, but when something happens, we say you are wrong. We say somebody is to blame. But if somebody is to blame, that means you have to have a law. Something has to be right, and something has to be wrong. So it's an interesting argument. You can go find it on the internet somewhere, I suppose, and read it. So God says in Isaiah 45, verse 22, he says, turn to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. So it starts with this emphasis that God says, I am the Lord your God. The word Lord is that word Yahweh. We sometimes replace it with Jehovah. The Hebrew word is Yahweh. It's God's personal name that he shared with Moses. And it comes from a verb that means to be. So it talks about God as the absolute, unchangeable, existing, ever-living, self-consistent, the one who is manifesting himself continually. I am, I am, I am. He said to Moses, I am that I am. That word Hayah means to be, and Yahweh, that is this name he gives when Moses says, who will I say sent me? So God is absolute and unchangeable. I am. It's not I was. It's not I will be, but I am. He was here before things. He'll be here after things. He is absolute and unchangeable. He is also self-existent. And he says, I am the Lord your God. And notice that it is not plural. I am the Lord your God, which is singular. Right? So I am the Lord your God. So it starts with this declaration of who God is. So in some sense, it doesn't make sense going further in one sense. I'll show you another sense in which it matters. If you do not acknowledge that Yahweh is God, not that anyone else, but that Yahweh, who is the God who is declared to us in the scriptures, in the Bible, that Yahweh is God. And if he is God, then if he gives us instructions, then those instructions should be treated with a certain level of seriousness. And he says, I am the Lord your God. That's a word that was not unique to Israel. It was a word that was used even of the pagan religions. It's a plural word, Elohim, that really translates gods. But it speaks of God as being the sustainer, but it's always used in a singular sense. When it refers to God, that it speaks about God as the sustainer of the universe, the God who makes everything, the God who is the absolutely most powerful one that there is. Some of the things that we sang this morning when we sang What a Beautiful Name Is It? It is. Notice also that he is a speaking God. So it starts with who God is. He is God. He is God alone. Right? He is always there, never changing, omnipotent. Right? He is also a speaking God. It says, and the Lord spoke. And the Lord spoke. It's not the first time we see God speak. In fact, when God creates human beings, the first thing God does is to speak to them. When God creates them, it says in Genesis, God created them male and female, and God said, multiply and replenish the earth. The first thing he does when he creates human beings is to speak to them. And I suggest that he started to speak then, and he has never stopped. He still speaks today. And last week we talked about the role of the Holy Spirit, and that's one of the ways that God speaks to us. So he's a speaking God. He's also a deliverer, because he says, I am the God. God spoke these words saying, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. So God is absolute. He is self-existent. He is the supreme one. He is a God who speaks. And that's interesting. So he's not far off and away. He is Emmanuel, as we heard the other day. He is close. He's a God who looks down. In the Psalms, there's one psalm that's translated that God steps down. God steps down in order to lift us up, to make us great. So he's a God who speaks, and he's also a God who delivers. He's a deliverer. He's a redeemer. Just like he brought. So this is telling us some things about God. It is historical, but it's telling us some things about God about who God is and what he is able to do. So he is still able to bring people out of bondage. He's still able to bring us out of difficult places and constrained circumstances. He's still able to liberate us. And there's one more observation on this. The Decalogue, and some people prefer we call it that. It's more than commands. It's the Decalogue, so literally it means 10 words. The Decalogue is in a format. It's in a format of what was called a suzerainty treaty. Suzerainty means royal. It's in a format of a royal treaty or a royal covenant. And how were these formatted? First, there was a preamble. And in the preamble, the king who was entering into this treaty, he identified himself. So we see, I am the Lord your God. Then secondly, there was a historical prologue. An historical prologue. And in which this king would sketch his interaction with these people and what he has done for them. And so we see it says, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. And then the king would set forth the stipulations of the treaty. What you were expected to do. And that picks up where we are here in verse 3 and continues. There are 10 stipulations. So God presents himself. So the format of this, and this is important, I'll tell you why in a minute. The format of this is in the format of a royal treaty. So God uses this format that the people he was speaking to might have been familiar with, so they would understand something. So he declares who he is. I am the Lord your God. He declares what he has done for them in summary up to this point. And then you see, on the basis of who I am and on the basis of what I have done for you up to this point, now this is what I require of you. And what these treaties really did, which is important for us, is that they established a relationship between the king and the people to whom that king spoke. So that the Decalogue or the 10 Commandments really have to do, and we'll come back to this strongly at the end, really have to do with relationship. God was really outlining the terms of relationship with himself as Israel's king. Israel was a theocracy, ruled and governed by God. He was outlining the parameters of his relationship with Israel. So it suggests to us right away that we serve and follow God not just out of obligation. The major reason to observe and obey what God says should not be fear of God. All is good enough if you have no other reason. But it should really be driven by relationship to God. Are you following me? Now, let's look at the implications of this commandment. First, it rules out polytheism. Now, you know what is polytheism? Polytheism is the belief in many gods. Right? Polytheism is the belief in many gods. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4, it's known as the Shema. It's one of the, it's similar to what you call the Shahada in Islam, which is this belief, this foundational belief about God. So every Jew would recite this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Polytheism is the belief in many gods. There are many gods. So when people tell you, you can believe anything, every and all the ways lead to the same place, all the rivers lead to the same sea, which is not true, and all the whatever, it's really saying that, and our world likes that. Nobody challenges anything. Everybody can believe what they wish. Right? So it rules out polytheism. And this was important for Israel because the purity of Israel has to do with salvation and the coming of Christ. So if Israel was contaminated by the nations, then Jesus would not have come and salvation would not have come. So God, this command that says you will not have any other gods rules out polytheism. Egypt had 2,000 gods and goddesses. Some of them are depicted on the slide. Right? You had Amun-Ra, who was the hidden one. You had Mut, who was the mother goddess. You had Osiris, the king of the living. Anubis, if you saw that movie. The divine Ambama, Ra, the god of sun and radiance. Horus, the god of vengeance. Tot, the god of knowledge and wisdom. Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, and it goes on. Right? In Canaan, Canaanite religions were also polytheistic. So Israel came out of a polytheistic setting, and they were going into another polytheistic setting. Right, like most of the nations of the Near East at that time, right? So families normally would venerate the dead in the form of household gods and goddesses. So if you remember the story of Jacob and his uncle when he was leaving, I forget his uncle's name right now, but he complained that they stole his household gods, right? And Rachel had taken Laban. Rachel had taken it. So the Canaanites believed also believed in many gods. They were also polytheistic. So Israel was living in this polytheistic setting. And God says, listen, I want to suggest to you, we live in a polytheistic setting in more ways than one. God says, listen, you must have no other God beside me. So among the Canaanites, you had Elohim. Elohim was a generic name that was used for God. Then you had Baal and Asherah and Ashtarte and Molech and Chemosh and Tammuz and Dagon that we read about in Samuel and so on. There is one well-known world religion that is prominent in our country that has 330 million gods. And those are not my words. That comes from one of their own scholars. 330 million gods. Because of their belief that every and anything is a god and can be a god and venerated. And one of their own scholars says there are 330 million gods. And I won't identify what it is, but you could figure it out. So it rules out polytheism, the worship of many gods. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Then secondly, it rules out atheism. And what is atheism? The belief that God does not exist. The belief that God does not exist. So, I'll point out there are two kinds of atheism. There is one that is theoretical. So you have some people who will argue with you theoretically and philosophically why they don't believe in God. And there's one that's practical. The practical one, most of the people we meet are not theoretical atheists. The theoretical atheists you find in the universities. There are one or two of them who write on the papers, like Kevin Baldeo Singh. He says he's an atheist, so I'm not libeling his name. All right? And a couple others who write in the newspaper. They are theoretical atheists, and they will seek to argue why you shouldn't believe in God because so and so on. So the bulk of people you meet are practical atheists. They live their life as though God does not exist. And they are really no different from the theoretical atheist. Are you there? I saw this interesting thing. I'm digressing for half a minute. I saw this interesting thing of this atheist guy in the newspaper. I probably said this to you already, or maybe or somebody else, who's saying that he enjoys Christmas. Was you I was telling that maybe? You know, he celebrates Christmas. And then he sought to defend it. He said, I don't believe in God, but I like Christmas. Now, the practical atheist says the person who lives his life, we make our decisions as though there is no God. Our value systems, the value systems we follow are those that have no reference to God. So it's as though there is no God. The principles we live by are principles that are not directed by God, therefore it's as though there is no God. The way we spend our time and everything is as though there is no God. Most of the people we meet are really practical atheists. And none of them here today because if you're here, you probably believe there's a God somewhere. Probably, yeah. I could be surprised. So it rules out atheism. It presupposes the existence of God. So it says, you shall have no other gods before me. So it doesn't try to prove that there is a God. It starts with this assumption that there is a God. And thirdly, and this is where we will, it rules out humanism. If you don't know these words, good to learn them. It rules out humanism. Humanism, here the definition of what humanism is from humanists themselves. Humanism is a progressive philosophy of life that without theism, which is the belief in God, so without God or other supernatural beliefs, so they believe there is no God, there is no supernatural, affirms our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. Somebody tell me repeat it. Why are you trying to write it down? We're not in class, girl. But I'll repeat it once. It is a progressive philosophy of life that without theism or the belief in God or other supernatural beliefs or anything supernatural affirms our ability and responsibility. So it says, listen, we could live right. I know I'm finished reading it. I'm going to finish reading it for the person who's trying to get it. Our ability and responsibility to lead ethical lives of personal fulfillment that aspire to the greater good. So in other words, it says, listen, we don't need God. We don't need anything super. We could work out how to live right. Right? So among ourselves, we could work it out. What does that do? One of the things it does, it lifts human beings to the place of God. So we decide. We are our own bosses. There's no God up there. Nobody to tell us what to do. And goes back to Ravi's moral law argument. Right? We could, among ourselves, we could figure out what is right and what is wrong, what is ethical, what is unethical. And the other part of that is finding personal fulfillment. You know, the other side of humanism is enjoy being human. Enjoy being human. Experience everything. Do everything. You have no limits, no barriers. Are you there? Such as the ones that will be put on us by God. So, it rules out polytheism. You can't believe in many. God says, I am God. Singular. You can't believe in no God because God just spoke, right? And the assumption is when he says worship, it's the assumption that he exists. And then it rules out humanism, which is really another way. Humanism is really another form of atheism. You live your life without God. We can rule our world. We can run our affairs. we can achieve everything we want to achieve. And many people live this way. Many people live this way. We can achieve whatever we want to achieve without God. We don't need God. Right? And some of those guys who write in newspapers, they feel God is only for the weak and the stupid. It's the opiate of the masses, according to Karl Marx. It's people who don't have no sense and who don't have nothing. But that is not true. And so it rules out. We can't live our lives that way. Amen? And I don't want to say finally, because you might get the wrong idea. The final main point, that's probably the best way to say it. Right? The final main point, it rules out idolatry. It rules out idolatry. You shall have no other gods. And in fact, this is the key focus of this commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. And idolatry takes two forms. You have external idolatry. I remember being in Thailand, and we went to visit a Tibetan Buddhist temple. And, so there we were tourists, so we were taking pictures and things. But there were people who were coming in. And they would come in with a little bucket or basket with food and so on. And they would go and bow down before, so it had a huge Buddha at the front, and then there were many on the sides. And they would go and bow down before these idols. And then when they bow down before them, they would leave their little basket with whatever. And then they would go. And I thought, these people are people who have real trouble. And they scrape together something and come and present it to this idol with the hope, and of course they pray to this idol, that this idol will hear them and deliver them from their trouble. Are you following me? And I stood looking at them and I said, wow, how empty this is. That wasn't the word I thought. I'm not thinking of the right word right now. That you going to, because I know those idols can't help them. But they don't. So here are you putting all your confidence. And that some of them may be poor people who may have traveled miles upon miles, and they come to bow down before this idol. So there's this kind of idolatry where we have an external idol, something that we set up, and we bow down to it. When I grew up in the village there was a house that had at the front they had a little shrine, I suppose I would call it now. We call it a house then. And they had a Hanuman, which is a Hindu god, with the features of a monkey and a tail and so on. I remember when we got to that house, we would run till we pass it. As little children. Don't talk about when you had to pass it in the nighttime. There are some parts on our road, some all don't know what I'm talking about. There are some parts on our road that when you got to that point, you stopped. And you waited for somebody else to be coming up the road. Either that, or you wait for a car, which was not very many in those days. And when you see the car, you start to run while you have that light until you get to the end of that area. So they had a physical idol. Many of us don't have physical idols, but those in our context who believe in idols. And, that's something else you can talk about another time. But why not physical idols? In the book of Isaiah, God talks to this. And in essence, God says, I just read the first part of it. I won't read the whole thing. Isaiah 40, verse 18. To whom will you compare me? What image will you compare me to? Just to whom will you compare me? What image? And next week, actually, that will be more the focus of it. Right? Because we'll talk more directly about idols. It's just who? So which representation can adequately present who I am? So it forbids idolatry. You shall have no other gods before me. So you can't have nothing physical. Nothing in your bedroom. Hello? Nothing in a shrine out front. I go in a little dangerous place here. Nothing in your church. The church split over that issue into two halves at one point in history. Nothing in your church. Right? So when you come here, this pulpit is not an idol. There's no magic down here. The same God that here is the same God in your seat and outside the door. Are you there? So that's the external idolatry, and I don't need to spend long there. And then there's also internal idolatry, and that's where I spend the time. Well, some of the things that we put before God, because really, you shall have no other gods before. That word before is an interesting word. That word before means, the word literally means, Indira, face. That's what the word literally means. Face. So you can't have any God that competing. So you have my face and you have another face. God is establishing that He is the one and only God. You shall have no other gods before me. So an idol is whatever we put before God. Whatever we put before God. What are some of the things that might be idols? Could be possessions. Matthew chapter 19, verse 16. You know that story about that man? I look like that guy guarding his possessions there. That man in Matthew chapter 19, at the end of the story, I go to the end of the story, his barns brought forth, and he said, I'll build bigger barns, and so on, and so on, and so on. At the end of it, Jesus, oh no, I'm looking at the wrong passage. Matthew chapter 19 is the story of the rich young man who came to Jesus. I'll come to that other passage. Came to Jesus, and Jesus said, sell everything you have and come follow me. He says he changed his mind. So he went away, sorrowful. So the things we own, can be what we put before God. Right? So I'm not here because I got to carry my car to the car wash. I shouldn't just link it to church, because it's not just church, right? So whatever it is, if you have to make a choice between this and God, which do you put first? Right, so our possessions, that's one. A second thing is our wealth. And that's one of this rich man, the parable of this rich man. God said, this is what Jesus said at the end of that parable. He says, this is what happens to anyone who stores up things for himself and is not rich toward God. In 1 Timothy 6, it says, command those who are rich in this present world not to be arrogant, not to put their trust in their wealth, which is so uncertain, but to put their hope in God. In other words, we don't put our things before God. We don't put our wealth before God. We don't put people before God. Our spouse, family. Jesus says, anyone who loves his father and mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves, now of course, Jesus is not saying do not love your father and mother, right? Anyone who loves his son or daughter, the issue there is more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who doesn't take up his cross, and it's repeated in several ways. One man said, I want to go bury my father. Jesus says, leave that alone. And Peter said, we've left everything to follow you. And Jesus says, all those who left home or brothers or sisters or mother or father or children. Right, so I always say to you, you see that lady there? She's more important than all you. Just so you know. I watching some people face like the vex. Sorry. That's my first responsibility. Right? But she's not before God. That's the difference. If you marry Akil, that's how you should feel about your wife. Talk about this principle of centricity. Must be the center after God. After God. Right? After God. And let me, since I hear, right? Even before your parents. When married people say, hefty, wow, pastor. Even before your parents. Because a man will leave his father and mother. And, of course, that does not say you neglect your parents. The Bible talks about that elsewhere, right? And then we come to another command that says, honor your father and mother. It says not to neglect them. But your spouse is supposed to be the central person in your life. And then probably your parents. And then your children. You women, all you're not married to all your children. Now, forgive me if I start a little, what is the word? Miss whatever? Misogyn something. Misogynistic. If I talk about a different issue, the issue with centricity is often a male issue. Everything else more important. And your wife get the dregs. On the other hand, with the children, is a female issue. So I'm hitting everybody. So everybody. So I can't say nobody will be vexed. Everybody will be vexed. I say, I'm married to your children. And sometimes we cling to our children because it's easier to relate to them than to relate to our spouse. Children love you all the time and hug you up all the time. But your spouse just quarrel with you sometimes. Oh, they get so quiet. What happens? Are they thinking? Right. Okay, I know I digress a little bit. So, people. But it's not just spouse and family. Of course, spouse and family, or brothers or sisters or parents, they are important people in our life. And it's not a call to neglect them. It's a call to put them in their proper place. You understand? So he says, no other gods before, nothing before me. But some of us is friends. Some of us in school, and it's our friends. I've ever told this story about this guy who had to suspend from school when I used to be a principal. They went to Cuba, big fight. So it come to my attention. Hey, look, I see my Stacy there. It come to my attention, and if I call the names, I know who I'm talking about. It come to my attention that they go and have this big fight in Cuba. So next day, they're facing the music now. So I call this guy. So we're talking to everybody. What happened? Oh, you're up in Cuba. Right? And of course, there's always a story. This guy says to me, somebody pay my passage. So I went. So he had no idea what was going on. His friends pay his passage. So he go on Cuba and end up in a big fight outside somebody's school. Sometimes we let our friends, and not only young people do that, older people do that too. We let our friends lead us. And I mean, having friends is good and normal, but it's when our friends lead us in directions that are contrary to what God desires. And when they are so important to us that we'll rather do what they request than what God requests of us. Making sense still? We're almost there. Work and career. Jesus, walking by the seaside, he saw two fellas, they were cleaning their nets. And he said, follow me. Peter and John. It says they left the nets and followed them. Now they were not just in Miaro, and they spot some fellas pulling seine, and they're going to pull seine. And when they finish, now they're helping the fellas, and Jesus come and say, follow me. They were fishermen. The nets were their livelihood. It says immediately they left their nets and they followed him. We live in a world where our employers demanding more and more of us. And in the context in Trinidad where we have all this additional labor. And I've had to say to people more than once, listen, you have to figure this out, you know. I know some of us work in contexts where we don't have much control. Some others of us work in contexts where we do have control. We don't have to work overtime every Sunday or every whatever. Talk to me, I'll get quiet again. I don't like what I'm saying. So yes, we must work and work hard. Most of my life I've been working 3 jobs. I still feel like I work in 2. Most of my life. But I say to couples, you have to conspire to make time for what is important. You have to conspire. So they want me to work whole every day, 24/7. I figuring out how I getting away from that. Because I had to carry my wife somewhere. Hello? Because I want to go to church sometime. Talk to me. It has some people I know, I work with them, I have meetings and things with them, and they tell you, listen, you have to finish this meeting by 6 o'clock Friday, you know. Or by 5:30 because I had to get home by 6. Because my so-and-so start at 6 on Friday. And they tell, I'm not working. I know we're not always able to do this, right? And I don't want you to misunderstand me. I don't want you to feel guilty for working hard or guilty for missing church. Feeling guilty doesn't change anything. So that's not my goal. But the principle still holds. That we must not let our work and career take the place of God. I know people who work 24/7. And not because they have to. They take every overtime assignment, Saturday, Sunday. Talk to me. Are you thinking about who you know? Never in the house of the Lord. We'll talk about that some other time. It says they left their nets. Work and career must be central. And then the pleasure. Must be central. Every so often I threaten to pelt my son PS4 over the fence in the bush. Why I shouldn't do that? Anytime it becomes more important, everything else is over the fence in the bush. It's going. Right? No, but we have an arrangement. We manage things. I don't want to be uncharitable. The 4 guys who were killed were out playing games or something all night on the highway. I don't want to be uncharitable. I know the parents and so on. So it's not to be unkind. And I know pleasure is just so wide. I have some pictures there, but it's just so wide. Enjoy life. And pleasure to its extreme ends up in what we call narcissism. That's the word. That's all they care about. Totally, absolutely self-centered. Enjoy myself, no matter what the cost. In this day and age, we still have people who sleep around and so on. There's crazy people. In this day and age. In this day and age, we have all kinds of other things happening. In the last days, it says in 2 Timothy, people will be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. They'll be lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. So it must not take the place. Now, none of these things I described is wrong. I hope you realize that. None of those things. But it's when they take the place of God. And the final one is myself. First Timothy 3, verse 1 and 2, it says, in the last days, people will be lovers of themselves. And Jesus, he said, if anyone comes to me and does hate father and mother, brother and sister, and even their own self, they can't be my disciple. Ourselves lead us to do things that we shouldn't sometimes. We damage relationships because we are selfish, self-centered. I want what I want. I will do what I want to do. I don't care. So my wife, as a counselor, I don't think I'm disclosing anything here, but sometimes she sees people who say, you have you're married, right? I don't know why I'm on this, but let me stay. You're married. You have some friend of the opposite sex that creating discomfort for your spouse because you're so close. And some of these people say, well, listen, that is my friend, You can't tell me who must be my friend. If I choose that person to be my friend, what are you vexed for? Hello? No, them should have really married to themselves. Then you have to worry about what nobody else think. Men will be lovers of themselves. Jesus says you have to forsake yourself. So what is this command demanding? This command demands first and exclusive devotion to God. That's the bottom line. You shall have no other gods before me. First and exclusive devotion to God. God should be the center of our life. How you know what's the center? Where your treasure is. Where your treasure is. Tells you what's the center. Where you spend your money. You spend it where it matters, where your heart is, what captivates you, and where your service is. What is worthy of your life? A good test. Does God have my exclusive devotion? Does He have first place in my life? So as I end, remember, I said the commands were written in the form of a royal treaty. They were establishing a relationship. These commands are not about rules. You don't get points for keeping them. So you don't go through and check, okay, I didn't kill nobody this week. I didn't steal anything this week. I was faithful to my wife this week if you're married. And, I didn't dishonor my parents, and chalk up points. At the heart of the command is a relationship with God. So we keep them not to chalk up points. We keep them because of our relationship with the God who gave them. And the other piece of this is that they outline, when you look at it that way, they outline some of the things that damage that relationship. So we keep them because of that relationship, and we keep them because we want to guard against anything that will damage our relationship with the God who gave them. So those of us who know Christ, I mean not just in these 10 summary statements or words, we must guard. If that relationship matters to us, we must guard against anything that damages it, including not being faithful to these stipulations that the king gave when he established this relationship. And the final thing, and I said it earlier in another way, it underscores that life hinges around relationship with God. Life hinges around relationship with God. So if you are here today, you have to ask yourself, do you have a relationship with God? That's not what I asked you. I didn't ask if you have a relationship with the church. That's not what I asked you. I didn't ask you if you have a relationship with some religion. That's not what I asked you. That is not what I asked you. I didn't ask if you're a good person. That's not what I asked you. Do you have a relationship with God? To start with. And if you do, what is its quality? What is its quality? Is it a visiting relationship like the sociologist tell us? You just come and go? Just only come and sleep in the night and go home? Is it common law? You know, we just be the same place, but we have no commitment, no formal commitment to one another. When God described a relationship in the Old Testament, he said, I'm married to you. He said, I'm married to Israel. And Israel is an unfaithful wife. That's the metaphor he uses. So if you don't have a relationship, you probably may want to work on getting one. And that's the easiest thing. Because Jesus died to bridge the gap that separates us and to allow us to reconnect with God. And if you're here and you're a Christian and you know God and you value that relationship, and how are you guarding it to make sure that nothing interferes with it? So let's bow and close our eyes as we wind up this morning.